Welcome, JCPA friends and families from across the ocean. I'm Dan Diker, president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and this is the JCPA Wartime Diplomacy Update. We are joined today by an esteemed group of experts here at the JCPA. Let me get right into it and introduce our team right as we not only commemorate, celebrate, but assess and analyze the state of play on International Women's Day. We have a very dramatic moment to consider right now about the recently released report on sexual violence in Israel and in the territories under Israel's control, in Judea and Samaria, known as the former West Bank of Jordan, and Gaza, which is in the middle of an assault stemming from the October 7th massacre by Hamas and the ongoing Hamas-Israel war right now in Gaza. We have a very important topic to consider, assess, and analyze. On my right, Ruthie Blum, a former advisor in the office of the Prime Minister and a JNS, Jewish News Syndicate news service here in Jerusalem, soon to have a forthcoming podcast, which everyone should be stay tuned for. Dr. Fiamma Nirenstein, senior JCPA fellow, one of the leading, as well as, by the way, a senior advisor to the Israeli foreign minister on the issue of combating anti-Semitism, and a return guest, advocate Sarah Weiss Ma'udi, who is who has been everything at the UN, including the first Israeli ever to be a special advisor to the 77th president of the UN General Assembly. She has advised on counterterrorism. She has advised on the rights of women, as well as on sexual violence. She's part of the Israeli Interagency Task Force on Sanctions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem. And well, I tell you, I hope my daughter has a resume that is 1/10 what you have, advocate.
Or your son.
So thank you for rejoining us. You've been here before, and our audience was deeply appreciative of your contribution. So here we are. I would say, ladies and one gentleman in the middle, but here we are. The International Women's Day, a hyper focus on sexual violence against girls and women in the Middle East, following an unprecedented atrocity, I would say, in the 24 to 36-hour period that took place on October the 7th, 2023, and revelations of unprecedented sexual violence against girls and women in Israel following an invasion by the Iranian-backed Hamas into Israel and the subsequent war against the Iranian-backed Hamas in Gaza, as well as the Iranian-backed Hezbollah in the north. That's the context. Dear colleagues, let us start with a couple of comments from you, Ruthie Blum, where you are. How important is this moment? And it's a moment in which we have to judge in terms of the failures versus the success of the recently released report by the United Nations Secretary General.
Well, judging by past and present UN behavior, I would say that the report may have no impact whatsoever, though I hope I'm wrong. In the first place, it took months and months for such a report to emerge. And in the second place, the hypocrisy of women's groups all over the world, and particularly ahead of International Women's Day, the hypocrisy of the feminist movement and the Me Too movement to suddenly turn its back on the believe any woman who claims she was sexually abused, particularly when there are hours and hours of audio and video footage that Hamas terrorists proudly broadcast themselves, and when there are multiple eyewitnesses, both to the rapes and forensic evidence about the rapes, and suddenly there was a question about whether any of this actually happened. So yes, I hope the report has an impact. I'm very disappointed in some of the language in the report. That is a bit equivocal in certain places, but I am glad that finally, at least the UN is acknowledging that systemic sexual assault did take place on October 7th and is continuing to take place in Hamas tunnels toward both women and men hostages.
Let me just, I'm going to run to Sarah, ask her
Sure.
being in, and then I'm going to ask you,
Oh, sure.
Advocate Sarah Weiss Ma'udi, how accurate, from your standpoint, as an advisor to the UN for so many years on so many issues, did they get it right this time in terms of their findings on sexual violence, or is there a type of moral equivalence that, I mean, let's be clear, the UN has been problematic in the sense of creating moral equivalence between victims and their almost a fetish, as Douglas Murray has put it from the United Kingdom, in putting Israel, in casting Israel as a villain, when in 99.99% of the time, Israel has really been the victim of such behavior.
Well, I think with this particular report, we have to give credit where credit is due. And, you know, in Judaism, we have a saying, the one righteous person in stone, and really Special Representative Pramila Patten, who's an expert on sexual violence in conflict and was appointed by the Secretary General, did the right thing and came here with a team of experts, forensic experts, experts in sexual violence from throughout the UN system, and really spent a significant amount of time, she herself 5 days, which is a significant amount of time for a diplomatic visit. Her team was here for 2 weeks and met with all actors.
Sarah Weiss Ma'udi, did the UN get it right this time in your view on sexual violence?
So we have to give credit where credit is due, because this was a rare moment with the UN where you had the special representative for sexual violence, Pramila Patten, willing to come, as we say in Judaism, the one righteous person in stone, willing to come and actually look at the facts, talk to all the relevant actors in the system, be it government officials, Ministry of Justice, the police, the military, all relevant civil society actors, eyewitnesses. She brought a whole team from the UN system, including forensic experts, experts in sexual violence. And Itamar Eichner actually this morning had a piece in the paper where he wrote about, this is what a UN official should be doing. This is not someone who has ever gone on record to either praise or to condemn Israel. She is neutral, and she came looking for the facts and looking for what actually happened. Now, I have to say, you know, it comes obviously several months after October 7th. We would have liked to see this earlier. And there are a number of actors, and this has to be said, who received letters and evidence from us that clearly indicated, beyond a reasonable doubt, evidence of both gross sexual violence and other kinds of just brutality and sadistic violence. As was mentioned earlier, Hamas sent this out actually as part of their way to terrorize the Israeli public. And then some of it they pulled back in a way to gaslight us. And whereas many UN actors until now have been quite silent or have said really minimal things about this, where, you know, like if we take UN Women, for example, where they're usually, as they should be, very vocal about condemning the rape of Yazidi women or the rape of Ukrainian women. And you know, as another panelist said, was, you know, always in the area of Me Too, and we believe you, they're doing what they should be. But with us, with Israeli women, there was silence. And this is indicative of a greater problem in the UN system. But in terms of this report that was published 2 days ago, this is remarkable. This is a report from an expert who has talked to witnesses and really starts to tell what happened in terms of sexual violence on October 7th. Are there parts of it that we wanted to see more? Yes. With Israel, always UN bodies are very stringent and strict about making sure there's verification, and usually they want 2-3 sources usually to cross-verify it. So there are a number of incidents where she wrote in the report that she and her team could not verify it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, by the way. but it's a start. I can even just read you some of the findings, which are just remarkable in her conclusions, that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred at several locations across the Gaza periphery, including in the form of rape, gang rape during the October 7th attacks. Credible circumstantial information, which may be indicative of some forms of sexual violence, including genital mutilation, sexualized torture, or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, was also gathered by her team. She also wrote about the hostages, and this is very important. And I think any podcast that we do, we have to remember that there are still hostages, men and women. And by the way, both men and women, and she says this clearly in her report, were victims of the sexual violence. She writes, with regard to the hostages, the mission team found clear and convincing, that's an even higher level, that some hostages taken to Gaza have been subjected to various forms of conflict-related sexual violence and has reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may be ongoing. And I think there you have a clear statement about what went on and what continues to go on, and really emphasizes the urgency of getting the hostages out. So I think that, again, to give credit where credit is due, this is an important piece. It is what should be done by the UN. It's not, it shouldn't be something remarkable. It is the UN doing their job. And it is a rare instance in the case of Israel of the UN doing their job.
Well, here's one. I'm going to turn to Dr. Fiamma Nirenstein. There's one word that I think undermines the entire report. And you mentioned it twice. It's called conflict-related sexual violence, as opposed to genocidal sexual violence with the self-declared goal of destroying the Jewish people, which appears in the Hamas covenant. When the UN says conflict-related, it is automatically understood to imply moral equivalence. I want to turn to Fiamma Nirenstein.
But can I say one thing on that, just very briefly? You have to understand, the UN people have very specific mandates. And this special representative, her mandate is sexual violence and conflict. She even wrote about in her report that she knows that there was a much greater scope of violence, and a lot of things that we saw as someone who prepared the evidence for the UN, as violence is much greater. And I don't want anyone to be confused. Things happen besides sexual violence, horrific, nightmarish, Holocaust-like things in Technicolor. But her mandate is to focus on sexual violence and conflict, and that's why she wrote about that. There are other representatives that write about genocide at the UN. Her focus is on sexual violence.
There's a political point here.
So I want to say that I agree either with you and with Sarah. But first of all, genocidal is a word that she could easily have had as an adjective when describing the slaughter. And because there was also slaughter and not only rape. So that it was not difficult to admit that there was a genocidal intention, because all the victims belong to a certain people, and the genocidal intentions of the aggressors have been declared many times. But conflict-related doesn't, on the other side, diminish at all the importance of the aggression. Why that? Because it means that the weapons of the raping has been used as a weapon, as a proper weapon in a conflict. It is not that it happened here and there as a matter of craziness of some of the warriors or some of the terrorists. It has been specifically, largely used as a conflict weapon. It has been a weapon like a
weapon of war.
A weapon of war.
It's more than that. It's for as a legal advisor, the test is for crimes against humanity is it widespread and systematic? And here we have examples, and she's writing about it being widespread and systematic, i.e. it's a crime against humanity. It's not even a war crime. And like you said, it's not just that one group went crazy and that it was some sort of criminal act. This is premeditated, pre-planned violence against Israel. So I totally agree.
But here I want to add something to this, and here I agree with Dan on the fact that there is something missing here, and which is the name of the perpetrators that she should call Hamas. Hamas And this is not been done in the relationship, where she says that there are several groups, that there has been this and that, you know, and in fact, we know, yes, probably that there were also people from the Islamic Jihad, but who cares? I mean, Hamas is the culprit. And this is very important for the feminist movement, I want to add. Tomorrow, by the way, there will be in Rome a very big demonstration, just on the wave of the, and this is very important, because first and foremost, we want to see women in the square protesting against what has happened. Until today, we didn't have. Now in Rome, we will have in Piazza Sant'Apostoli at 7 o'clock. I will send a film there. I'm very glad that this is something that is going to happen. But I want these women there not only to say that women have been raped and we are against rape. I want them to say that Hamas has raped them and we are against Hamas. This is what has to be said all over the world. I mean, the perpetrators have to be identified. Otherwise, what is it for? Here we have a war, and this war must be recognized as a just war against the people that committed these atrocities. And among them, the most important, I would say, together with the killing of newborn and children, is the women raping and slaughter. So this calls the United Nations to reunite, as they did not do until now. And here the foreign minister of Israel is right, the Security Council. He must call the Security Council about such a big crime, must declare Hamas a
terrorist organization.
Terrorist organization, and then to apply all the sanctions that must be applied in this case.
Here's
So just to give you,
yeah,
glimpse.
go ahead. And then we'll turn to Ruthie. Go ahead, Sarah.
Just to give you a glimpse, at the UN, Hamas, amazingly, nor Hezbollah is considered a terrorist organization. The only terrorist organizations that are designated are Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and Daesh. And I think that this isn't exactly right, that the next step, the logical step for this report, is to use this as a basis to designate Hamas. Now, is this politically realistic? That's a different conversation in terms of the reality, unfortunately, in the Security Council and in the UN as a whole. But this is what should be happening next. You know, in the Security Council, they already had months ago a meeting on violence against Palestinian women and girls. And they should be discussing the plight of women and girls in this whole conflict on both sides. I have no problem with that. But they wouldn't even let a civil society briefer from Israel, the American ambassador, asked that an ex-Israeli expert, not an official like me, an expert who had worked in the UN system, who had worked in CEDAW, the Convention Against the Discrimination of Women, brief the Security Council, just tell the facts of what had happened. And they wouldn't even allow that. They wouldn't even allow the discussion. So now we have the facts, and now let's take it to the next level.
Ruthie, what do you say?
Well, this is further complicated by the fact that UN bodies themselves are in bed with Hamas and other terrorist groups. But in this case, I'd like to raise the issue of UNRWA, which, as it should never have been, it's an illegitimate organization in the first place, because its whole raison d'etre is to perpetuate the Palestinian so-called refugee problem. But that's less important than the fact that we now know that many UNRWA teachers and other employees actually are Hamas members and are on the Hamas payroll and participated in the October 7th massacre and in rapes and abduction. So that makes it, you know, the UN on the one hand is sending a team to investigate. And on the other hand, at the same time, the UN itself, other bodies, and we know there are other international bodies that are in bed with Hamas in Gaza, because Hamas doesn't let anyone operate without being in cahoots with it there. And we saw that even the International Red Cross said that it can't deliver medication to the hostages because Hamas won't let it. So, you know, that is why I'm very skeptical about the effect that this report will have on the UN itself. It may have some effect on skeptics outside, though again, the wording of the report is problematic, aside from the fact that it also repeats the occupied territories, the occupied Palestinian territories, for one thing, and Gaza is not occupied territory. And for another, it's not that it does mention Hamas briefly, but the point about it is that it makes it sound as though this is a problem of wartime, as you both pointed out, rather than a concerted effort. A part of the massacre, the plan was to rape these women. And in fact, there is a recording of terrorists on October 7th, one of them saying to the other, oh, no, don't kill that girl, she's for raping. It's
They use the word horse. She's our
no,
horse.
that's a different tape. That's a
That
different
was a
tape.
different
They use the
video
word
that,
Sabaya.
Sabaya.
which means
But
like a captive, or usually used for sexual and
Yes,
other,
exactly. But I'm saying this was a different recording where you actually hear, no, not that one. Don't kill that woman. She's for raping. So we know that this was part of the plan. And as I said, the UN has behaved appallingly towards Israel in every shape or form. And since October 7th, it is even worse, because you have the Secretary General saying, no, this is saying this didn't happen in a vacuum. So as I said, I have real trouble believing. I take your point that we should give credit where it's due. The only question is, does that just end up in some kind of vacuum? And will the UN get credit for having released such a report and then just leaving it sit there? That's another issue that's worth discussing.
I also would like Sarah to tell me why, in her opinion, it took so long. I'm telling you from a journalist point of view. I'm a journalist, okay? It took me a couple of days to realize that this happened. How that? Because I went to speak with the people, the saint people, I mean the Kadosh people that were just composing the bodies and trying to give them back for recognitions to the families and to bury them in a civilized way. They themselves told me how the pieces of women that they were trying to put together brought extremely evident signs of the fact that they had been sexually
Mutilated, abused.
What now? They told me terrible things. It took me 3 days to get the news, and you can find the proofs of it on the articles that I wrote. I mean, that was what I heard, and this is what I wrote. I mean, proofs. The proofs were they themselves who had these poor bodies in their hands, right, and told the story. So why did they take 5 months to do that? Why? This is also I have respect from Pramila Patten, but why she didn't believe in the people that were talking to her and had to find the proofs beyond the testimonies. The testimonies are always the most important things in this story.
Sarah, why did it take so long?
So I want to sort of separate, her coming to the country was an official invitation. There was back and forth about the terms. We always have a terms of reference of the, of how the visit is going to work and what are the parameters. I want to leave that aside. I mean, I've been asked in almost every interview that I've done on this topic, again, as the person who drafted a lot of the evidence that went out to the different UN bodies. For example, if we take UN Women, it took them 2 whole months, and I know exactly what kind of evidence they saw, to say anything. In fact, on the second day, the executive director blamed Israel on October 8th for escalation. That's the word she used in her private X account. And they kept on tweeting about the plight of Palestinian women and girls, which again, they should be talking about all women in the conflict. That is their job. All women are part of their mandate, but that includes Israeli women. So I'm asked this question a lot, and I think I have 3 possible answers for it. The first probably goes to what you are an expert in and you're going to do it, but I think it's a little bit simplistic. We could simply say it's anti-Semitism, pure and simple, full stop, and move on with our lives. And I think all the things that have happened, not just in the UN, if we see the presidents of different universities, anti-Semitism is so close to the surface, and just how it bubbles to the top with just a little bit of scratching. And so that's definitely an element, but I don't think that tells the whole story. I think, Ruthie, you're really right that in the UN, at least, there's this kind of thinking, and in many international circles, I think amongst women's groups too, this thinking that somehow we can understand or justify or excuse what happened, that it didn't happen, quote unquote, in a vacuum. And like I said, that's a very dangerous point of view. Leave the conflict aside, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict aside. That's a very dangerous point of view for women and girls throughout the world, because the minute you start saying that we can somehow understand and justify certain incidents of violence against women's bodies, that they can be used. So let's say we take the conflict in Kashmir and we say that, well, we can, we don't want to justify it, but if there were Pakistani terrorists who violated Indian women, we could understand that because of the situation there. Or ISIS, we can't justify it, but we can understand Islamic frustration with the attitudes of the West, or an immigrant's how the West has treated Muslim immigrants and the discrimination. And so we're not going to excuse violence against women, but we're going to try to understand it. Or even with Hamas, if they're doing these kind of things to women in Israel, they're going to do it to Palestinian women too. Rapists don't stop.
They do it to Palestinian women. Reports from the UN.
They marry children that are 10 years old.
Exactly.
What do they do?
And so, and think about a woman who goes to the streets to protest Hamas. What's going to happen to her? And I think a third thing that we have to remember is and this is someone who spent 5 years at the UN and worked on UN issues for 2 decades. The UN is a very, very political place. And I think lots of the heads of these different UN bodies, particularly rumors have it, there hasn't been a secretary general who's been a woman, and there should be. Lots of the different heads of agencies or different UN actors are thinking about their next promotion in the UN system. And when it comes to the UN or the General Assembly or how the dynamics work, there's an automatic vote against Israel. In the General Assembly, you can say the sun is purple with pink polka dots and it's Israel's fault. And by a show of hands, they will approve that. And so these actors are thinking, not so much about doing the right thing or doing their job, but about thinking about the moving up in the ranks. And what we've told donors to all these UN bodies is, put your money where your mouth is. If you're giving to these organizations, and certainly as a feminist and an activist for women's issues, I would like to see UN women doing their job, working for equality of women, working to protect women. But make sure that UN Women or UNICEF that works on protecting children as a mother, again, want to see UNICEF doing their job. They do important work throughout the world, but want to see them do their job in all contexts, including Israeli contexts. We want to see them be neutral. We want to see them appoint heads that are neutral and don't. Now, that doesn't mean Israel might have criticism coming to it in certain contexts. And when the criticism coming is objective, and like any other country, we will engage. Patten's report, it wasn't all perfect, and it wasn't all everything that we would have written as a government. But you have a situation where someone is coming objectively who hasn't had a history of speaking against Israel, or like the investigation in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where you have people on the investigation who talk about the Jewish lobby and use classic anti-Semitic tropes. I mean, what is that? And why isn't that person sent home? And what we've told donors is, if people are not doing their job, just like in a corporation, investigate, call for something better. There is a different way.
Would you call right now for Hamas to be designated by the United Nations following this report as a terrorist organization engaging in mass sexual violence against Israeli women and children?
I mean, Hamas had to be designated long ago. This didn't just start with October 7th, by the way, and Hezbollah as well. The only reason these groups are not designated again is because of vetoes of certain countries who are in cahoots with them or who are in bed with them. And we need to put pressure on the UN. And we need to also make sure that countries continue. There are many countries throughout the world who have designated Hamas, the EU, the UK, Japan, even Egypt. The Hamas is a terrorist organization. And we need to make sure that that continues and that more countries do the right thing. And that obviously includes the UN. That is what the UN was set up to do, to be the source of international peace and security, to maintain international peace and security. They haven't been doing their job, certainly not in our context. In our context, the opposite is true. They've been a factor that has poured, oil on the fire of the conflict, and they have organizations where their very employees that are on the UN payroll are participating in these egregious atrocity acts, atrocity crimes. And we need to call for a better UN, and a more neutral UN, and that obviously that the UN should be doing the right thing, which unfortunately as a whole, as a system, it has not been doing.
How much political leverage does the United States, as one of the major donors to the UN, have over the words revitalizing and reform have been dominating the discourse with regard to the Palestinian Authority, which needs to be completely reconstructed from the ground up? But the question is, Ruthie Blum, do you think, as an American-born Israeli communications expert and foreign policy expert, that it's very important for Israel to press the United States? Question for all of you, really, in order to take the lead here, moral clarity?
Oh, absolutely. But it's not a question of whether Israel pressures the United States. The United States has a duty to do it. And in fact, when Donald Trump was president, one of the main things he did that was so wonderful was to defund UNRWA. I mean, he didn't kick the UN out of New York, but he did defund UNRWA and came along the Biden administration and restored the funding. So, I don't think Israel really has a say. The United States has to grasp that Israel is its key ally in the Middle East, has the same values, and it's that the United States is not doing Israel a favor by demanding, this of the UN. And I don't believe that it can be revitalized or revamped any more than I believe that the Palestinian Authority can be revitalized. No, it has to be.
I unfortunately have to go for another briefing.
Yes.
I'm going to Baku virtually right now.
Your last word, Sarah. Your last observation.
I think that we shouldn't just put the responsibility on the U.S. By the way, there are many donor states, many European states, and everyone has a role to play in making sure that the UN does its job, not just the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. is Israel's #1 ally and an important ally, and we appreciate its support, certainly at the UN. But I think we need to call on other actors who talk about the importance of gender, of protecting women, of peace and security. We need to call on them, of neutrality, objectivity. We need to call on them to do their job. And so I'm sorry that I have to get off. I'm going to.
Thank you very much, very much, Sarah Weiss Ma'udi.
See you as always.
Bye-bye.
Happy International Women's Day, and I hope that next Women's Day will really be a celebration for Israeli women, for the hostages, and for all women around the world.
Thank you very much, Sarah Weiss Ma'udi. Appreciate it very much.
Okay.
Good. Have a good trip. Go ahead. Your thoughts.
My thoughts are that actually we cannot save the United Nations from what it is. Since the time of the Soviet Union, the United Nations has served as a bastion for the worst politics that have always been voted by a majority formed by the third world states together with the communist and the socialist states. So that's why nowadays, in December of 2023, which means after the 7th of October, Israel was hit by 3 resolutions against it. 3 in 1 month, in 1 day. 3 resolutions of the United Nations. And all along the year, there were 14 resolutions against Israel compared to the 7th that were dedicated to North Korea, Russia, Iran, China, Turkey, I mean, all the other states together did not deserve the blame of the United Nations more than 7 times, while Israel alone 14 times. So this tells you all about the United Nations. So what I think is that we can hope in the fact that the world nowadays is in such an evident situation of distress, and there is a group of criminal states that are the one that I mentioned now, actually, that are becoming so dangerous for everybody that things will remix. I don't think that Europe can, Europe has been voting against Israel for a long time. Now things are changing there. There are some states that don't, some states that abstains. And I think that they start to understand that Russia, after what it has done against
Ukraine.
Ukraine, Zelensky, all the people there, is not somebody that you can cope with. There are still somebody that think that this is possible, that they will make, but usually China, Russia, Iran, especially Iran, the one that Italy just a few days ago threw bombs against was engaged in a battle with the Houthi down in the Gulf. So you see that these countries are engaged nowadays in a war that has been imposed on them by these criminal states. And so this is something that will certainly have to change the situation. How long it will take, and if this can be useful to Israel due to the fact that we are in such an urgently difficult situation, I don't know. But for sure, what I can see is that the United Nations are a big failure, and that this failure is now becoming evident to everybody, and not only to Israel.
Ruthie Blum, last observations. What can Israel do from a policy standpoint at the UN? Clearly a hornet's nest of trouble. And you know, is banging on the table, screaming, shouting, and threatening going to help? Is there really, from a policy standpoint, something Israel can do?
I think that what Israel does at the UN has been largely PR, that it may be important, and I think we've had some really good UN ambassadors. It's very important, and Gilad Erdan, our current ambassador, has made some important speeches, done important gestures, but I don't think that it actually has a policy effect. I think what it does is strengthen the people in the world who are on Israel's side already, but need the tools to be able to justify their own positions or to make the arguments. It's important in that sense, but I don't see that the UN has any positive role in the world. As Fiamma was pointing out, the bad actors run the show over there. And by the way, if you're talking about women, for example, a report on Palestinian women is not about how Hamas and Fatah and Islamic Jihad abuse Palestinian women. It always goes back to the good actor that supposedly is doing the abuse. Everything is upside down. So, you know, if it were up to me, and I'm not the leader, thank God, not the leader of Israel or anywhere else, but if it were up to me and the privacy of my own home, I would say that we have no business being part of the UN. And I think that the United States also should declare it a body that goes, it's not just that they don't do their job.
Persona non grata.
Yes, they do the opposite of their job. The opposite. They support bad actors in the world. And you know, Fiamma pointed that out. We have the most ridiculous situations. We're on the Human Rights Council. You have abusers sitting on the Human Rights Council. It is so ridiculous that I don't see the role of the UN is not to keep the peace and do anything that its original mandate was. It does just the opposite. It foments war, and therefore I am completely against it.
There we go. Well, there we have it. International Women's Day, a scorecard or a report card for the UN. Not sure that it would really pass muster with in any university and be allowed to continue to the next semester without being sent to the dean's office, to put it diplomatically. But I want to please thank all of you, Ruthie Blum, former advisor in the Office of the Prime Minister, JNS columnist, podcast, and all around intellectual on issues of U.S. and the Middle East international community. Dr. Fiamma Nirenstein, dear friend and colleague for so many decades, author of some 50 books, thousands of articles on, and now the senior advisor to Israel's foreign minister, Israel Katz, on the issue of combating the new anti-Semitism. Thank you ever so much. And of course, to advocate Sarah Weiss Ma'udi, a really multi-talented, and she's had so many different positions at the UN. Thank you very much to all of you for giving us context, analysis, assessment in this very, very difficult moment. Sexual violence against women and children in the state of Israel by Hamas, the Iranian-backed terror organization that has to be brought to the Security Council and has to be outed by name. That would be a moment of moral clarity for the United Nations that I think it appropriate for all of us to advance and emphasize. Thank you all very much. We'll see you again soon at the JCPA Wartime Diplomacy update. See you. Shalom from Jerusalem.